Well, welcome everybody to our taster seminar on decolonizing modern languages. We had, of course, planned to run this symposium together with the University of Birmingham. Joe Ford and Emmanuel Santos had set up a very full day of discussion on this subject of decolonizing modern languages, which was supposed to have run 30th to 31st of March. And as this wasn't possible, we thought we would now provide a taster session to give you a little bit of an insight into what would have happened on that day and on the discussions around this topic. Joe Ford, one of the organizers, is here and will talk about the planned symposium, but also discuss some of the ideas that would have been aired there. He will present, and after that, Naomi Wells is going to take over for a response to Joe's presentation, and after that we'll be open for questions and answers. So participants could use the chat function to let us know what questions they would like to raise. We'll gather these and have them at the very end. So welcome, and let's get started. Joe, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Godela. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides. So bear with me 1 second. Where are we now? Oh, hold on. Sorry. Give me a second. Let's get this the right way around. Okay, so you should be able to see the slides there. Yeah. So thanks for hosting, and really, yeah, as Godela said, we were going to host this as a conference in Birmingham together with Emmanuel Santos in the Department of Lusophone Portuguese Studies, and we had a really fantastic group of presenters and abstracts submitted, and we are obviously hoping to reschedule the conference as soon as possible. What I will do today then is just start talking a little bit about kind of the origins of decolonial theory, the importance of the relationship between decolonial theory and modern languages, and think about some of the themes that we will explore when the conference is rescheduled, and we'll obviously bring details of that as soon as we have them. So I just want to start by, like I say, thinking about decolonial theory, not in any great depth, but just to kind of give an overview of the key issues, and then think about, as I said, a relationship between decolonial theory and modern languages in particular. And first of all, I suppose, acknowledge my own positionality within these debates. So when Audre Lorde writes that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, she refers to, in the immediate context, women of colour making their difference their strength in bringing changes to dominant feminist thought that hadn't really sufficiently dealt with differences of race, sexuality, and class. And fundamentally, she urges Black women to abandon the frames and tools of that dominant feminist critique in order to bring about real change. But this quotation, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, prompts us all, I think, to consider the positions from which we speak as teachers and researchers in particular. So for me, I I think this would mean acknowledging my white, male, native English-speaking privilege. Researcher in a UK university is very likely in some way a result of that white, male, native English-speaking privilege. It would mean acknowledging the fact that I am trained in a modern university, modern Western university system, which still centers its teaching on predominantly white male heterosexual writers, which still centers much of its teaching around writing and literature as dominant forms of cultural expression, and whose foundations are built on money often made from the slave trade and colonial exploitation. And I've just given a few examples there, but I'm sure we could find others. So the question here is twofold. One, is it even appropriate for me to be tackling these questions given my privilege and position? And two, if it is appropriate, and I happen to think it is, then how do I abandon these tools which have been embedded in every aspect of my upbringing and my education? And it seems to me that this is where we all need to begin when thinking about decolonisation. So just some contextual points about modern languages and post-colonial or decolonial theory. So I think modern language and its aftermath, and this is a key kind of starting point for us when we were writing the call for papers for the conference. We can also see that some language areas have been better at others at addressing the colonial past, and this might well be, and it's a question I'm asking here on the slide, it may be that this is because these kind of language areas are more implicated in practices of colonialism. So, for instance, Francophone post-colonial studies, which comes out of French studies, or decolonial theory coming out of Latin American studies, but equally Hispanic studies. Projects like Transnationalizing Modern Languages, which Naomi was involved in, of course, taking an alternative perspective to Italy and Italy's colonial past, and then more recently expanding German studies, which looks to the kind of, I suppose, to think about post-colonialism, decolonial theory in terms of German studies, but also widening the curriculum and diversifying the curriculum. And we actually did have an abstract from the founders of this project, expanding German studies, and I think they may well be, Godela will be able to confirm later, but they may well be giving a presentation for us as part of our series of online talks at the IMLR. So my question here is modern languages in particular in need of decolonizing? I think it's important for us to think more about the modern in modern languages. Why modern? Why not just languages? Is this modern something to do with the relationship between the discipline of modern languages and the legacy of colonialism in European modernity? The fact that we are modern languages tells us something about the methods that we use to understand and encounter the world around us. And these are the kinds of approaches informed by modern thought. So, like much of modern philosophy, we claim to know the world. I would argue through a largely Cartesian logic, which privileges spatial or geographical, perhaps a kind of colonizing knowledge over spatial and temporal encounters that occur in everyday life. And that difference between the term knowledge and the term encounter, I'll come back to towards the end of my talk. So thinking a bit more about modernity and the modern in modern languages, we might want to ask to what degree the project of the discipline is associated, the discipline of modern languages, that is associated with knowing the world through a colonialist lens. Because of the discipline's intrinsic relationship with modernity, we can see how the approaches and methods researchers might adopt in modern languages originate in a project of European modernity that is, of course, tied up with processes of colonization. So decolonial theorists like Mignolo and Quijano, I've gone a slide, sorry. For decolonial theorists such as Mignolo and Quijano, the link between the Eurocentric idea of modernity and the colonization of the Americas in the 15th century is at the foundation of a totality and what they think of as a form of totalitarian power that denies diverse, contradictory, heterogeneous, indigenous forms of knowledge production and experience. And this totality ultimately informs approaches used within our modern disciplines. So perhaps we need to ask ourselves a difficult question of whether modern languages, as currently configured, is participating in reinforcing that totalitarian project, and to what degree we need to take action to unpack the colonial roots of modern languages. And what does that action look like in practice? Sorry, there we go. So how does decolonial theory translate to decolonial practice? And I think this is one of the central questions for our conference, because our conference is focused on teaching. It's not so much focused, but of course we acknowledge the theory, but it's more focused on practice. We want to bring a kind of we want to kind of exhibit the practices that are going on, but also where we can make changes to the curriculum as it exists across modern languages departments in the UK and beyond. So how does decolonial theory translate to decolonial practice? To effectively redistribute power, to disrupt what we might think of as an all-encompassing, self-perpetuating system of knowledge and thought, modern knowledge and thought, or Western knowledge and thought. We must begin, and this is what Alison Phipps says in her book, we must begin with the process of decolonizing knowledge. And that is A, thinking critically and self-reflexively about histories of power that have configured and constructed knowledge upon which our contemporary politics, society, and disciplines are based. And B, taking action, as Alison Phipps puts it, to learn the arts of decolonizing. Even if that means, I think this is important, even if that means getting it wrong during first attempts. So I think Phipps really stresses in her book that it's better to have a go and get it wrong the first time than not to have a go at all. And Phipps actually in the book continually stresses the messy nature of what she calls a creative human endeavor to learn these arts of decolonizing. She says, unlearning habits of oppression and inequality is not straightforward or neat and tidy, and this should not be an excuse for inaction. It will mean sometimes language is where we relive those violences and struggle with their ongoing effects as we try to use them in recovery. And this recovery and going back to a kind of self-reflexive mode is precisely the kind of work that we're interested to do during the Decolonizing ML Symposium. But I think that this recovery should also intersect and can also intersect with the strategic recovery of languages learning in the UK and in other countries. And one of the main reasons I think we are so bad at learning languages, and especially non-European languages, and in particular indigenous languages, is that we are very bad at understanding how language is fundamental to making and realizing the world that we live in. And thereby, of course, the vital role of languages in reinforcing oppressive and unequal relations of power between human beings. In many ways, then, this isn't just about getting better at knowing our post-colonial history. It's actually about understanding that language is the primary means through which we encounter, coming back to that word, encounter people in the world. It's about acknowledging that learning languages offers us a unique opportunity to develop new methods and approaches in encountering and, in fact, remaking the world. It's about acknowledging that we can't simply know the world, but that worldliness, so that's the kind of bringing the world into existence through creativity, imagination, and action. Worldliness is a capability that we all possess. So decolonizing is not simply about knowing in other ways, but much more about the time and space of the encounter. And I think Phipps captures this very well in her book. I put it on the slide there, Decolonizing Multilingualism, came out in 2019. Just to give an example, and then I'll stop. After this, I'll conclude. Phipps details how she, on one of her research trips, she learned the Maori language of Te Reo. And this was a trip to New Zealand. And this is, Te Reo is a language that privileges vision, hearing, and touch over the written text. And for Phipps, then, decolonizing multilingualism is primarily about what she calls the slow, careful pace of lifelong learning. It's about stepping beyond the comfort zones of knowing dominant European languages and pushing oneself into perhaps initially more uncomfortable encounters with languages and cultures. So commenting on the experience of learning Te Reo, Phipps writes, through beginning to learn Te Reo according to the ways which were alien to me as one versed in communicative language teaching and the pedagogies of the colonizers. So Phipps is very aware here of method and the importance of method and challenging methods and approaches. And now the globalizers, I was offering myself as a potential vessel, an intercultural holder and handler of words which are needing more space, more tending than those of my own cultural tradition for their survival or revival. For Phipps, then, decolonizing is about placing oneself in the vulnerable situation of not knowing and of relinquishing power and control. And the aim of our conference then, and I'll end here, is to explore where these practices can be or have been taken into the classroom successfully or unsuccessfully. Effectively, we want to bring people into an encounter and to explore what this might look like in practice. How do we deal with this messiness in the classroom with students who are versed in the dominant practices of reading literature, of learning through reading? So what are the opportunities here for students who don't naturally take to these more traditional modes of learning? So thinking about reading there, students who don't get on so well with reading long texts, are there other ways of engaging those students in a kind of decolonized practice? And ultimately, how can all this reshape the discipline of languages for the future? And that's a kind of bigger question that we're asking. I'm sure that we'll still be asking at the end of our symposium. So I'll just stop there and pass over back to Godela, or perhaps over to Naomi who might have some questions.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a really wonderful glimpse of the discussions that the symposium would have enabled and will enable. I have a couple of questions, but I'll hold back now and hand over to Naomi.
What I might do is just stop sharing the slides. Is that okay? Yeah, brilliant. Should be back to normal. Does Naomi need unmuting? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was really interesting and really useful to kind of get an understanding of the underlying kind of questions. And as you say, I think the key thing is there are a lot of tensions and there's a lot of messiness and there's not easy solutions to kind of some of the points you raise. And I think that's really kind of key to what you're addressing. And one thing that it reminded me of is, because I've been, these are tensions I think we're all struggling to work through. And one thing, in a way, it's easy to do the kind of theory, the criticality, the reflexivity, and where the challenge really comes is transforming that into practice, which I think is why it's really important that your event does focus on that move into actually action and practice, where it's much harder to kind of reconcile or work through those tensions. And so one thing I wanted to mention, it reminded me, one of these tensions is obviously in the UK, modern languages, and this is something we've all discussed a lot, is often kind of considered to be quite a narrow set of languages, mainly European languages also that were generally the languages of the colonizer rather than vice versa. It reminded me, there's an interesting article by a social linguist, Ingrid Piller, who talks about monolingual ways of seeing multilingualism. And so she argues that multilingualism research is often based on an underlying assumption, departs always from English. Most multilingualism researchers actually depart from English. And this social linguist started in a German department, and she said, she had a different perspective because she started with much more kind of different language perspectives. And she says, in the past, linguists in Germany or elsewhere would often move across languages much more in their use of theory. And this is kind of in the kind of older kind of academic period. Often we had these texts that would maybe have untranslated German, French, Latin, with the assumption that readers often had a receptive knowledge of more languages.
Yeah.
And she sees that as a positive on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it's always a narrow set of kind of European languages, and it was based on this very narrow elite circle of people who knew these languages. Yeah. And then she says there's this kind of tension of how do we then move into, because now people often push back against that, this assumption that everyone speaks French is very kind of elitist or, not translating. And then, but the other angle is that we just rely on English. So we're in a very multilingual setting and we go, well, we've got to just rely on English because it's the kind of the language we're most likely to have in common. And I've had this with teaching kind of mixed groups of kind of teaching across languages. Is it's very hard for me then to introduce text in other languages because not everyone in the class speaks them. So then I end up relying on English, but then I'm like, but that's not really the solution either. So I just say this is it's a tricky tension. I don't expect you to have an answer, but I just wondered what your kind of thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think it is, as you say, a really tricky area. I think just to highlight, I can kind of cast my mind back a bit, some of the responses that we got to the call for papers. I think there were some really interesting and kind of innovative ways of of teaching a kind of or adopting a kind of decolonizing practice in the classroom. It wasn't always to do, I mean, perhaps I'm not really answering the question, but it wasn't always to do with multilingualism in a kind of direct way in terms of students encountering multiple languages, but giving students a different experience of language. So thinking about, I don't know, thinking about teaching outside of the classroom. And just, I think there was one on which we chatted about briefly, I know, a few weeks back about walking classrooms, outdoor classrooms. I can't remember the exact details of the proposal, but yeah, certainly I think I mean, we ultimately fall back on something, don't we? Yeah. I guess and English is the language that we're having this discussion in, and it's the language. I mean, even when we teach cultural modules in modern languages, we're often teaching in English, which I think is perhaps a shame. I think a lot of students demand this kind of encounter with language. Yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult question that I can't answer. I suppose what the symposium will hopefully offer is the possibility of discussing these issues in more detail and seeing what kind of practices are out there already. And then also kind of coming back to FIPS and, we've got to try, we've got to start somewhere. And if that means failing, then so be it. And then kind of, trying to do better from that point of failure. So yeah, I think getting things wrong, we are going to get things wrong. And we are going to fall back onto English. There's no doubt that I think me and Emanuela would end up standing up and presenting this conference in introducing the conference in English. So I don't think there are any easy answers to this. And every time I talk about decolonial theory these days, I always end up saying that, I don't think there's always a question about, the difficulty of dealing with this. And yeah, we all end up kind of falling back on our privilege, which is monolingual ways of seeing the multilingual world. I think that is a kind of privilege because we work through English, and we have to acknowledge that ultimately the rest of the world has to learn English, and that is a massive problem, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much both to Joe and to Naomi. If I could now encourage the other participants of this call to use the chat function and raise your questions under the Zoom group chat. I will then be able to see these, and I can then ask Joe to comment. While you're doing that, Joe, if I could ask a question, and I'll even become visible again. So, Joe, you were using, which I found very, very interesting, you were using the notion or the concept of encounter when you were talking. And that obviously, I mean, maybe it was meant, but it obviously reminded me very much of Sarah Ahmed's use of encounter, which is very much interested in getting rid of the idea of the other, getting rid of the idea of fetishizing the stranger, and making sure that a real encounter means that it allows a forming of identities on both sides of this encounter, on both sides of the conversation. Is this what you had in mind, or is this an extra tangent, as it were?
I think I get this very much from reading Alison Phipps, actually, because it strikes me, I mean, I'm pretty sure she does use the term encounter, and it strikes me that what she is describing throughout her book is a series of encounters that, as you say, do not involve this dialectic of self-other. Actually, that is not part of what she wants to do, and it's not a part. I don't think she sees that as a part of what decolonizing is. So I think it's a very important point, and yeah, deliberately moving away. I mean, I suppose I pitched it in relation to knowledge and the kind of stable category of knowledge, and then trying to think of knowledge. Well, trying to think of encounter as an alternative to knowledge in that sense. But it strikes me that that what you're saying is very it, resonates a lot with what Phipps is saying, and that's very, yeah, and so absolutely, yeah. Although I wasn't specifically getting at that, that's it fits within the kind of thought process of decolonizing very well, actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's this emphasis on mutual learning, isn't it? Which is important there.
Yeah, the shared experience, the mutual exchange, encounter. I think it's a very useful term in that sense. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. We haven't got any other questions, but if there are any, please
comments. Comments.
In the meantime, let me just say, to pick up on what Joe said earlier, yes, the expanding German studies team, so that's Tom Smith, Nicola Thomas, and Rich McClelland, they have committed to contributing to our website in one way or another, so that will be coming up. And of course, we will also let everyone know about a rearranged date for the symposium as soon as we can say anything about that.
Yeah. I mean, I will, I'll have a discussion with Emmanuel about that. But I think, obviously things are a little bit up in the air in terms of when we'll be able to reconvene in person.
We have a question from Catherine now. Catherine, if I unmute you, you can ask your question yourself. You should be able to speak now. Okay, I'm sure, that doesn't quite work. So I'll go back to the safe option, which is Catherine is asking, have you contacted Mark Turner in ILAS, who is an expert on this, because he could be speaking at your conference?
Mark Turner? No, I haven't actually, but I certainly will. I will get in contact with him. I mean, when we get a date for reconvening, I'll certainly get in contact with him. Yeah, Mark Turner, yeah. In ILAS.
And Andrea is also asking a question. Andrea is saying, I love the thinking about modernity and postcolonialism. So she's got not a question, but a comment. Modern languages is a specifically English term. In German, it is neuere und ältere Sprachen. In French, langue vivante. Do you have a comment on those different terms?
That's an excellent question. My immediate response is I need to think about it. But that is a really excellent question. Thank you, Andrea. Modern languages. Yeah, I suppose to draw it back to what Naomi was saying about the way we are coming at multilingualism from a very English perspective, from a monolingual English perspective. In some ways, I think deconstructing the English modern languages is particularly appropriate because, and also because I think what we're mainly trying to intervene in a UK-based setting of modern languages. So most of the abstracts that have come in to us are colleagues working in UK settings. There are a couple of colleagues coming from the US, and obviously, but again, that's a kind of Anglophone setting. So I think, just to kind of not answer the question by means of saying we're coming at it from that kind of Anglophone angle, but also trying to offer a kind of critique of UK-based practices, UK-US-based practices in languages. Personally, I mean, langue vivante. Sorry, what was the German term again?
Neuere und ältere Sprachen, so new and old languages.
Yes, yeah, which kind of reminds me, I suppose Oxbridge call it modern and medieval, don't they?
Right, yes.
Modern and medieval. Yeah. I suppose, I suppose all I'd say about that is, personally, I don't see why we shouldn't just call our discipline languages. Why don't we just get rid of the modern altogether? But clearly there is tradition, and there are kind of institutional reasons for maintaining the term.
We also might have a fight with the classicists on our hand, but yeah.
That's true. That's true. Although I suppose some departments just think if Leeds integrated classics into its modern language, well, they have to change the name. They changed the name from modern to Department of Languages and Cultures and Societies, I think. So there is a struggle, a disciplinary struggle going on there as well at a kind of institutional level. Which
I think it's actually quite a good point, because it makes us think about the context of in which we do what we do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also looking at our institute in particular, the Institute of Modern Languages Research, we do have a kind of largely European focus at the moment. So, perhaps in that sense, modern is appropriate, but I don't think. I mean, I think it's worth questioning. Is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to close this little seminar. We have another question coming in from Catherine. Catherine is asking, modern languages will become languages bit by bit across universities. Yeah. And the question is, should we collaborate more with social anthropologists who know these languages and live next door in SOAS, as it were? Yeah.
I think the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. And I, in fact, one of the presenters meant to be coming to our conference is a social anthropologist and works on minority, I suppose called marginalized or indigenous languages. And I think, more collaboration with SOAS, the better in this project and in other projects. And another thing I suppose could add to that is in terms of the research proposal that Naomi and myself are putting together at the moment, which is on Latin American communities in Paris. We are interested to adopt the methods of social anthropology and ethnography and bring that into modern languages. So I think there's a lot of crossover there, and you can certainly see that in Alison Phipps's work and in the book. So I think that's all for the better, definitely.
Great, excellent. Let's leave it here. Thank you all for participating. Thank you to Joe and Naomi in particular. And we'll try and exit this chat.